Hey yo, what's going on YouTube? It's your man Supreme, and welcome back to the Real Rap Show. And this is episode 69 of the Real Rap Show, sentenced to life plus 420 years in federal prison. The story of Darryl God Whiting. Now, before we get this episode started, I want to say thank you to everybody that has been tuning into the Real Rap Show since day one. Everyone in the comments, and also everyone that gives me great feedback about the show. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so y'all can stay notified whenever I drop a new episode of the Real Rap Show. And follow the Real Rap Show on Instagram at It's the Real Rap Show. Now let's get this started. Darryl Whiting was born in 1956 in Corona, Queens, New York. Growing up in Queens, young Darryl was surrounded by poverty and crime. At 12 years old, Darryl joined the 5% Nation and earned the name God or Young God. At this time, Darryl was already getting into trouble with the law. When Darryl was 15 years old, he was the most notorious stick-up kid in Corona, Queens. He was robbing drug dealers, sticking up stores. It didn't matter to him. If you had something that Darryl wanted, he'd take it. The older guards in Queens would often tell Darryl to slow down, chill out. They would tell him things like, "Shorty, you making the block hot." But Darryl, even though he respected the older guards, he kept robbing people. And he did this for years. When Darryl was 24 years old, his luck ran out, and he was arrested for numerous robberies and was given 10 years in prison. Darryl did 6 years and got parole. When Darryl got back to Queens, it was 1985. Shit was different. The game had changed. Darryl wasn't feeling Queens anymore and decided to relocate. He was now 30 years old, and hustling was still on his mind. A few months after his release, in the midst of the crack epidemic in Queens, there was a lot of dudes in the crack game making millions of dollars. There was a police officer that had got bodied in Queens, and there was speculation that Darryl was involved in it, even though allegedly it was all hearsay and Darryl was never charged. Things wasn't going his way, so Darryl packed up and went to Boston. Now Darryl really had to get the fuck out of Queens because there were drug dealers that wanted to kill Darryl because shit was so hot after the cop incident. Every block had cops on it. TNT was rushing all the drug spots. Niggas could not get no money. And they felt like Darryl and his guys were responsible for that. They felt like if they wouldn't have did that to that police officer, shit would not be like this. And dudes was sending threats from everywhere. So Darryl left because he knew someone was gonna kill him or he was gonna have to kill someone. When Darryl got to Boston, he entered Roxbury's Orchard Park projects. He had some family that stayed there. Darryl attracted attention from everybody in the projects because of the jewelry he wore. Darryl didn't have any problems because a couple of the dudes knew his family. Everybody that knew Darryl called him God and had respect for him because of his affiliation to the Gods and Earths. The projects already had an open drug market. Darryl watched and observed everything that was going on in the projects. He saw who was strong and who was weak. In a short amount of time, Darryl knew Roxbury like the back of his hand and had a master plan to take over the projects. Darryl ended up meeting a lady that lived in the projects named Carol. Everybody in Orchard Park projects knew Carol. Carol was a loudmouth alcoholic that also smoked crack. Carol knew everything about the drug game in the projects. Darryl told her what he had plans to do, and Carol was down. Carol would often complain to Darryl that the niggas in the projects didn't know how to sell drugs, and the drugs weren't always good. Carol would say things like, "Somebody needs to come out here with some better product and take this whole shit over." Darryl began going back and forth to New York to buy crack to bring back to Boston. Nothing major. Sometimes it would be just an 8 ball or two just to test out. Carol began letting Darryl sell crack out of her apartment as long as he supplied her with drugs and liquor. The only problem Darryl had was with a gang called the Orchid Park Trailblazers, and they controlled the drug market in and around Orchid Park. One day, a crackhead came and told the Trailblazers that there was some New York dude selling crack out of Carol's apartment, and the stuff that he had was way better than the stuff that the Trailblazers had. They saw Darryl in the projects one night and approached him about selling on their territory, and a fight broke out. The next day, Darryl went back to New York and got some of his guys from Queens to come to Boston with him to hold him down. When they got back to the projects, there were more fights with the Trailblazers that turned into shootouts. Shit was getting worse and worse. Every other few days, Darryl would make a trip to New York to get more crack and to bring dudes back with him after telling them how much money was in Orchid Park. Darryl and his team started fucking the Trailblazers up real bad, stabbing them up, beating them with baseball bats. The Trailblazers called Darryl and his crew the New York Boys, and the name stuck. People in the projects started calling them those New York Boys. The Trailblazers finally gave up and began buying their drugs from Darryl. Darryl began making $100,000 a day inside the Orchid Park projects. Darryl was getting so much money, he opened up a few businesses in Roxbury. Darryl owned a bar/nightclub in Roxbury called The Crown and a daycare center. He would also throw a large parade every year for all the Caribbean people. Darryl started getting so much money, he began paying residents in the projects to let him stash drugs and guns in their apartments. Darryl ran into more drama with 2 dudes that were robbing crackheads of their drugs and money around the projects. Now, these 2 dudes were trying to get Darryl's attention. Darryl told one of his members about the 2 guys, and a few days later, the dude Darryl told saw the 2 dudes standing on the corner and walked up to the dudes and shot both of them at close range. One of the dudes died and the other survived. Darryl was now a boss. He decided to stop going to New York and started having girls from New York smuggle the drugs back to Boston for him, and he would pay the girls. Every week, Darryl would have different girls smuggling kilos into Boston. The kilos were brought for $12,000 and bringing back a $50,000 profit. Darryl and the New York Boys had over 5 apartments in the projects being used as drug spots. There were so many people coming to buy crack, they didn't know who was who at one point. But on the weekends, Darryl would throw lavish parties at the Crown. He would have the biggest rappers come perform. Kid Capri was the first DJ that Darryl flew to Boston to DJ his party. He would have rappers like Queen Latifah and more at the Crown on a regular basis. Whoever was hot in 1988, they were at the Crown. Darryl then opened up a video rental store called Crown Video, where you could rent VCR tapes. Now, who remembers those VCR movie rental spots in the hood? Hit the like button. He owned a barbershop called Crown Barber and a sneaker store called Crown Sneakers. All of these businesses were under Darryl's company, Crown Enterprises. At the daycare center, Darryl would have the kids taken on trips. He would pay people's rent and bills if they asked. But Darryl's name got so big in Boston, the state's attorney general wanted to know who he was and how was he able to have all this money. He then contacted the Roxbury police, and they began sending undercover cops inside Orchid Park projects to take a look around. The Roxbury police had a hard time trying to gain access into Darryl's operation, but they could obviously see that somewhere in those projects there was a drug spot. Now, they were able to send drug addicts in to buy drugs, but the addicts were so afraid of Darryl and his crew They would tell the police that someone outside sold them the drugs, but they would never tell the police where they actually got the drugs from. To get in good favor with Darryl, there were drug addicts that would tell Darryl and the New York boys about the addicts who were working for the cops. And when those addicts would show up to buy drugs, Darryl's dealers would beat the drug addicts up with baseball bats, hammers, I mean real bad, just to show, if we find out you working with the cops, this is what's going to happen, or worse. Once they did that a few times, there were no more addicts willing to help the police. Darryl and the New York boys was hot. They were now on the cops' radar. All types of shit started going down. Someone had got killed and their body dismembered. There were rumors around the projects that the New York boys was involved. But in 1990, Phoenix magazine did a story on Darryl about how rich and powerful he was, and the person that wrote the story compared Darryl to John Gotti. The feds got hold of the magazine and started investigating Darryl and the Orchard Park projects. Now, at the same time, there was a housing police officer that had ties to the Drug Enforcement Agency that was about to begin working undercover to infiltrate and help arrest Darryl and the New York boys. He was disguised as a street dude looking to buy some guns. His disguise was perfect. He talked and looked like a project nigga. No one could tell he was a cop. And he walked around carrying an Uzi. Somebody put him on to someone in Darryl's crew, and he began buying guns from the New York boys. He told them his name was JR. He would come around once or twice a week and buy a shotgun or a handgun from the New York boys. They once asked him, "Yo, what you doing with all these guns you buying, man?" JR told them, "I be reselling them to the niggas on my side for more money, and they buying them." The New York boys believed him. After buying a few guns, JR wanted to buy some cocaine and started buying small quantities of coke, which soon turned into half ounces, then ounces. It got to a point JR was buying so much cocaine from the New York boys, they started getting suspicious and made up a plan to make JR test the cocaine to make sure he wasn't a cop. A few days later, JR came back to buy more cocaine, but this time, the New York boys told him, "We want to see you try it out, man." And it put JR in an awkward situation because he had never sniffed cocaine and knew if he didn't do it, they were most likely going to kill him right there. So JR sniffed the line of cocaine, and the New York boys sold him the cocaine he came to buy. JR never reported they made him sniff cocaine, but soon found himself addicted to it and turned into a drug addict undercover cop. JR's main task was to buy cocaine directly from Darryl, which was hard to do, being Darryl was the top dog. Every time JR bought cocaine, he never saw Darryl, but one night he came to the projects to buy a few ounces and was directed to an apartment. When JR walked inside the apartment, surprisingly, Darryl was in there. He introduced himself to Darryl, and another person in the apartment sold him the drugs. Now, even though Darryl didn't hand him the cocaine or take the money, he was there, and that was basically enough to prove that Darryl was involved in selling drugs. JR was wearing a wire, and the feds now had Darryl's voice recorded inside the apartment. Undercover officer JR was strung out on cocaine, and after successfully infiltrating Darryl's organization for 6 months, undercover officer Jay Reed committed suicide, and now a federal task force was put together to go inside the Orchard Park projects and take down Darryl Guard Whiting and the New York boys. In late 1990, the feds arrested Darryl Guard Whiting, Sean Dixon, Ronaldo Pledger, Edwin Carmichael, Steve Wadlington, and 26 other people and charged them all with conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Darryl Guard Whiting was charged with running a continuous criminal enterprise, weapons charges, and conspiracy to distribute more than 50 grams of cocaine. From 1986 to 1990, Darryl and the New York boys operated a drug operation that had up to 100 workers that sold cocaine and crack 24 hours a day and were equipped with walkie-talkies, binoculars, and had Uzi machine guns and riot pump shotguns. On July 24, 1991, a jury found Darryl Whiting guilty of one count of engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, 21 counts of distribution of cocaine, and one count of money laundering. On October 7, 1991, Darryl Whiting was sentenced to life without parole, 240 months for each of 21 distribution counts. Sean Dixon was sentenced to 188 months in prison. Ronaldo Pledger was sentenced to 235 months in prison. Edwin Carmichael was sentenced to 262 months in prison. Steve Wadlington got 360 months in prison. All the other co-defendants were sent to prison also. Darryl Whiting is currently serving his life sentence at a federal prison outside Florida. He has tried numerous times to get his case overturned, and every time he has been denied. Thank you for watching. It's your man Supreme, and you were just tuned into another episode of The Real Rap Show, and this was episode 69 of The Real Rap Show, sentenced to life plus 420 years in federal prison, the story of Darryl Whiting. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on your post notifications so y'all can stay notified whenever I drop a new episode of The Real Rap Show. Now y'all stay safe out there. Real rap.